Hi, I'm Dave Watts. Welcome to the first part of GSA 200, Secure Search with SAML Bridge. In this session, we'll learn when the SAML Bridge should be used, what alternatives we have, and how to configure the SAML Bridge. Windows supports two protocols for network authentication, Kerberos and NTLM. Both of these can be used without explicitly prompting the user for credentials. We call this silent authentication. Both are supported by the default Microsoft Negotiate security support provider. Clients and servers can determine which they can use. Kerberos is the preferred option, and the Negotiate security support provider will try to use that whenever possible. But there are many things that might prevent Kerberos from working. In that case, NTLM will be used. NTLM is an older authentication protocol. Its roots go all the way back to IBM OS/2 and LAN Manager. It's not designed to be used on large-scale networks or networks with trusted and untrusted segments. As a result, it's not as flexible and useful as Kerberos. A Kerberos ticket can be sent from a client to a server, which can then send it to another server, which can use it for authentication. This process is called delegation. NTLM tokens don't support delegation. This limitation is referred to as double hop authentication, and it's a common problem in SharePoint environments where the user might authenticate against SharePoint, and then SharePoint sends the user's authentication token to another server. The GSA can, of course, be used in a SharePoint environment to provide search functionality from within SharePoint. The user authenticates against SharePoint, then SharePoint needs to send the user's authentication to the GSA. If your Windows environment doesn't support Kerberos, or your GSA can't be added to the Kerberos realm, it will be subject to this double hop problem as a result. The SAML Bridge can be used as a solution. The SAML Bridge can also be used for authorization. The SAML Bridge will send head requests to content servers impersonating the end user. The SAML Bridge can be used within Kerberos or NTLM environments. It's an ASP.NET web application that can accept a Kerberos ticket or NTLM token and return a verified identity to the GSA. It uses SAML 2.0 to communicate with the GSA and supports post and artifact bindings. Post bindings rely on the user's browser to send all information, while artifact bindings cause some information to be sent directly between the GSA and the SAML Bridge on a secure back channel. Google recommends post bindings, as they can be used in a high availability environment with multiple GSAs and multiple SAML bridges. However, some network administrators may want to limit SAML user data sent through the browser for security reasons. When a post binding is used, the flow of messages looks like this. First, the user makes a secure search request to the GSA. The GSA redirects the user's browser to the SAML Bridge for authentication. The user's authentication token in the browser is sent to the SAML Bridge with the request. For the token to be sent, the browser needs to be configured to identify the SAML Bridge server and the GSA as trusted for silent authentication. Then the SAML Bridge sends the user's token to Active Directory for verification. Active Directory returns the user's identity on a secure back channel, and the SAML Bridge returns the user's identity in an encrypted assertion back to the GSA. Since the redirect response occurs on the open intranet, the message is typically encrypted with SSL certificates for security. At this point, the GSA is able to complete the secure search. If the SAML Bridge is also used for authorization, the GSA will send a list of documents for authorization, and the SAML Bridge will make HTTP head requests impersonating the user. The process is very similar for artifact binding. All of the steps will be identical to post binding except for the last one. With artifact binding, the response from the SAML Bridge is not encrypted over the intranet, so the user's identity is not returned. Rather, a hash lookup, called an assertion, is returned. The GSA contacts the SAML Bridge once more over a secure back channel to decrypt the assertion and get the user's identity. At this point, the GSA is able to complete the secure search. In a high availability environment, you may have multiple GSAs using multiple SAML bridges. In that case, post binding is recommended. If artifact binding were used, each GSA would have to be configured to use a single specific SAML bridge because only the SAML bridge that generated the artifact will be able to dereference the hash lookup and return the user's identity to the GSA. If the bridge fails, the corresponding GSA won't be able to authenticate users. If, on the other hand, post binding is used, multiple SAML bridges can be placed behind a load balancer, and any GSA can redirect users to the load balancer and its SAML bridges for authentication and identity resolution. The SAML bridge can be installed as part of the GSA resource kit for SharePoint or on its own. It's an ASP.NET web application and requires an IIS web server. You will need to configure IIS to create a site and virtual application for the SAML bridge, and it must use its own IIS application pool. To have it use its own application pool, configure the virtual directory as a virtual application. You'll also need to change access to login.aspx so that anonymous access is disabled and Kerberos and/or NTLM are enabled. On IIS 6, this is done by enabling Windows Integrated Authentication. On IIS 7, Kerberos and NTLM authentication can be enabled separately. The ac.log file must be written to within the security context of any authenticated user that visits the SAML bridge. And ASP.NET applications use a web.config file for configuration information. You'll need to edit this text file to tell the application your GSA's DNS name, to provide additional information needed by the SAML bridge like the artifact consumer for artifact binding, and optionally to control the format of the returned username, username at domain, domain/username, or just user. You can also customize the IDP entity ID that the GSA will specify within this file. If you plan to use post binding, you'll need to install a certificate on the IIS server and grant access to the certificate for the security context or user account that runs the SAML bridge. There are several additional steps required if you plan to use the SAML bridge for authorization, such as enabling delegation and impersonation for the security context or user account that runs the SAML bridge. Once you've installed and configured the SAML bridge, you can test it by accessing login.aspx from your browser. Your browser will need to be configured to trust the SAML bridge server and to use silent authentication. You should not be prompted for credentials, and you should be able to see your Windows domain account identity in the returned HTML page. You'll also need to perform some configuration on the GSA. We'll discuss this in more detail a bit later. The instructions for configuring the SAML bridge are located within the Google Search Appliance documentation, but those instructions don't cover the use of post binding. That information is available from the SAML bridge download site on code.google.com. Let's take a look at setting up the SAML bridge. We're going to set the SAML bridge up for authentication only, and in that environment, head requests are not going to work. So we're going to use a repository that has ACLs. We'll use SharePoint, and we'll use the SAML bridge to perform authentication so that users can search SharePoint. So I've already connected to the server that we're going to configure. And on this server, this is a Windows server running IIS 7. I'm going to set up a SAML bridge instance in a separate directory. We've got this server set up so that we can actually run multiple concurrent SAML bridges. And my SAML bridge directory is going to be student SAML bridge 3.0. And I've already extracted the files from the zip in this directory. So inside here I can go into SAML bridge. I can see my login.aspx file, my web.config file, and everything else that makes up the SAML bridge. So back in IIS, I'll go ahead and create a virtual directory. So I can right-click on my default website, choose Add Virtual Directory, and I will call my virtual directory SAML Bridge 2, and I'm going to point this to that physical location I just looked at. So C, Downloads, Student 2, SAML Bridge 3.0, SAML Bridge 3.0, and then SAML Bridge. When I click on OK, you'll notice that I get this little yellow folder icon, and that indicates I have a virtual directory but not a virtual application. So in IIS, a virtual directory is a directory that's running in process with the rest of the website. Whenever we set up the SAML bridge, we really want to isolate it from the rest of the website. So I'm going to right-click on it and choose Convert to Application. So this is going to let me specify an application pool. And right now I have 2 application pools defined on the server. In real life, I would probably want to create a separate application pool first, but I'm not going to worry about that in this case. To create a new application pool, I would simply have to go up to Application Pools and click on Add Application Pool. Since I'm actually the only one using this server right now, I don't have to worry about it. But again, in real life, we do want our SAML bridge to be isolated. Now, within the SAML bridge application, if I go to Content View, I can view all of the files there. Login.aspx is the file that's basically going to receive our credentials. So by default, when I put files on an IIS server, generally they're going to allow anonymous authentication. So I basically want to turn that off. I'll select login.aspx and then go to Features View, which is going to give me all the different options. And I'm going to go under IIS. I'll scroll down a little bit. Go to the authentication icon. You'll notice that anonymous authentication is enabled by default, so I will disable that. And then I'll go to Windows authentication and I'll enable that. Inside Windows authentication, you'll notice that I have 2 providers, and in this environment we are not using Kerberos. So even with 2 providers, what's going to end up happening is that NTLM ends up being used. But if I wanted to, I could have either Kerberos or NTLM. So that's kind of the default behavior of Windows integrated authentication. When you enable that on a web server, the web server will attempt to use Kerberos first and then fail down to NTLM. So that behavior is fine. Now I'll go back to my SAML Bridge application and I can explore the directory right from the IIS admin console. And what I'm interested in doing is finding the log file, and in this case it's the file without an extension. In general, on your servers, it's probably a good idea to show extensions for known file types. So now I can see it's clearly ac.log. Now, I'm going to right-click on that, choose Properties, and then go to security, and I'm going to simply allow everybody to write to that file. So in my security tab, I'll go ahead and click on edit, and then add everyone. Click on check names, click on OK, and I'm going to allow full control over that log file. So basically, when a user authenticates, it's going to use that user's credentials to write to that log file. So this is the safest way that we can make sure that everybody can write to the log file. We could also use the authenticated users group. I'll click on OK. Now within this directory, I will also want to edit web.config. So I can just scroll down here, find web.config, double click on that to open it in Notepad. Now, I need to make a couple of changes in web.config. So by default, I need to specify where my GSA is. So inside here, you'll notice there are a whole bunch of keys. So I need to find the one for my GSA. Now, there is a lot of text in here. So if you have trouble finding that key, it happens to be assertion consumer, but you can simply search for your GSA. So that's going to show up in the file. So I'm going to go ahead and change that. I'm using gsa2.learngsa.com. So I can simply put that in there. Now, while I'm in this file, you'll notice I have an IDP entity ID. I'm going to need this back on the GSA. The default value is simply SAML-Bridge. I can leave that alone. If I change it, I'll have to remember what I change it to. Now, I'll go ahead and close web.config, save my changes. I'm going to go back to IIS Manager, go to my list of files in SAML Bridge, find login.aspx, and launch that in a browser. Now I'm using Internet Explorer. That's the default browser that's launched here, and Internet Explorer is configured to use silent authentication. So it sends my NTLM credentials automatically. This is the account that I'm logged into this server with, and I can see that it shows up right here. Okay, so at this point, the SAML Bridge is configured on IIS. Now I'm going to go to my GSA admin console. So on the admin console, I've already configured a data source that will have ACLs. So in my case, I'm using SharePoint. So I have a SharePoint connector set up. And if I take a look at the configuration for that connector very briefly, I can see that I have authorization by connector set up and authorization by ACL. So the connector is going to build ACLs, bring them back to the appliance. So at this point, I need to configure my GSA to use the SAML Bridge for authentication. So to do this, I'm going to go to the search menu and go to Universal Login Auth Mechanisms. I'll go to the SAML tab. And before I do that, I would probably want to make sure I'm not using any other auth mechanism with my credential group. I've already done that, so I'll go to the SAML tab. And inside here, I'm going to specify a name for my SAML mechanism, which can really be any unique value on the GSA using letters, numbers, underscores, and dashes. And then I need to put in my IDP entity ID. Again, this is what's specified in web.config. Because I didn't change it, the default value is SAML-Bridge. I need to specify the URL for login.aspx. So my server is istanbul.login.aspx. Now, we set up the SAML bridge. We did not configure it with a certificate, so we're going to have to use artifact rather than post. So I'll need to put in the artifact resolve URL. If I did have a certificate, I would need to enter the public key of that certificate here, and then I could use post bindings. Again, we generally recommend that you use post bindings for performance reasons and for handling redundant environments. So if you have multiple GSAs and you have multiple SAML bridges as a result, in an artifact binding environment, each GSA can only talk to one SAML bridge. In a post environment, you can put your SAML bridges behind a load balancer, and then the GSA can talk through the load balancer to whichever SAML bridge is available. So again, we're going to get better performance that way. Okay, so I'll go ahead and save this. And now I'm ready to go to a user workstation and configure and test that user workstation. So I'll go ahead and use Firefox for this. I'm going to open up Firefox. And inside Firefox, I'm going to need to configure it to trust the home of the SAML bridge and trust the GSA. So what I'm going to do is edit the config. I can go to about, :config. And I'm going to look for items that have NTLM in the string. So we have one called NTLM auth trusted URIs. I'm going to double click to edit that, and I'm going to add istanbul.learngsa.com. Now, previously you may have learned about configuring Kerberos. When you configured Kerberos, you would set up negotiate URLs. If you do that, then the browser is going to attempt to use Kerberos instead of NTLM and effectively will not really need the SAML bridge. If you had a GSA that was not Kerberized, but you were using Kerberos in your environment, then you would add to the trusted negotiate sites, and the GSA would then use the SAML bridge to validate the Kerberos ticket. Now, once I've configured my browser, I can go ahead and test it out against Istanbul. And what I should see are the credentials that I've used to log into this workstation. You'll notice I was not prompted. Now, if I add a subject parameter to my URL, this will let me test impersonation. So just for fun, I'll go ahead and do that. So user@domain, my domain is ad.learngsa.com. So if I just put in student@ad. So now you'll notice it says this message was written using the identity of student@ad. So once we do that, this SAML Bridge application is actually running in the security context of the user that I'm logged in as right now. So basically, that requires that I be able to write to that log file. Any user that runs this needs to be able to write to that log file. So now I'm going to do a secure search, and I'm going to display HTTP headers while I do the search. I'm going to look for documents from the Shanghai server. And you'll notice that I do see my documents. And if I go back to my live headers, you can see that I go to the GSA, and then the GSA sends me to the security manager, and then ultimately that sends me to Istanbul to the login.aspx with a big embedded SAML request. The SAML Bridge gives me this challenge, negotiate or NTLM. And then finally, I send my NTLM token to the SAML Bridge. After a successful authentication, I get sent back to the GSA, which receives my artifact and then lets me do the search. And I can see I'm getting results from the Shanghai server. Now if I go back to my GSA, take a look at serving logs, I can actually see the authentication process here. How I'm shunted through the SAML authentication mechanism. Sends my request to SAML Bridge. And ultimately retrieves my identity back from the SAML Bridge. And then uses that to figure out which documents I'm allowed to see. This concludes our first presentation, Secure Search with SAML Bridge. Thank you for watching, and make sure to watch the other GSA 200 presentation.